Hello and welcome. Great to be here. Great to be part of London Climate Action Week for today's webinar. I hope where you are, the pollen count is a bit lower than where I am, but I'm fully antihistamined up and ready to talk about Britain Talks Climate. My name is Chris Pollard. I'm a senior researcher at Climate Outreach, and we're here today on this webinar to talk about the new findings from this research, Britain Talks Climate, which began in 2020. So this was in partnership with More in Common and funded by the European Climate Foundation. Thanks to both of those for being able to be part of this wonderful piece of research. Britain Talks Climate paints a picture of up to the minute details of people's awareness and concern about climate change, around climate leadership, and around connection to nature. Today, we're going to be talking about the refresh that was done at the end of 2023, start of 2024, data collected around that time that builds on the knowledge and awareness that we had around how people feel about climate change and about climate leadership all the way back to 2020. And today we're going to be focusing on what Londoners think about climate change. The data set that we have and the learning that we have is across all of Great Britain, and we'll be touching on some of those wider findings that we had across the country, but really focusing and drilling down on what Londoners think about climate change. We've got loads of data to share, lots of recommendations as well to go through in the next sort of half an hour before we get to a Q&A panel session. But the main takeaway, if you're going to take away one thing from today, it's this that we've learned. People want climate leadership. They feel positive about government investment and leadership. So this is brilliant, right? This is what we really want the public, and we want people to feel. We want people to say, okay, we understand what the problem is. We can see it. We want to move forward and we want action to be taken. That's brilliant. And that's through work of communicators such as yourselves over years, trying to get people to understand what's going on and to build that kind of mandate for change. And it's from events like London Climate Action Week as well, building on that. But now we need to take this forward. We need to own this. We need to publicise it as much as possible so people in the country know that everybody else thinks that there's a positive way forward. And we also need to translate that to those who are making decisions on behalf of people as well. So I'll introduce you today to the folk who we're going to be hearing from. Emma James is a researcher at Climate Outreach. She was the project lead for the refresh of the Britain Talks Climate work at the beginning of the year. Emma's going to be presenting the results and the data in a few minutes' time. We also have Namira Hamid, who's an advocacy manager at Climate Outreach, and Henry Hall from the Greater London Authority, and they'll be joining Emma on a panel for the Q&A coming up in a sort of about 25 minutes time, I think. In terms of housekeeping, this session is recorded. No one other than the speakers is going to be on screen at any point. And the recording will be up on YouTube in a couple of days' time, hopefully, so you can share it with anyone who's not come today, or if you want to hear us all talk again. I should say that the chat function is disabled today, but the Q&A function is open. And please, anytime throughout the presentation and through the Q&A, please enter your questions in there for the panel as we get there. So that's enough from me, really. Before Emma jumps in with the findings from the study, I'm going to just hand over to Henry for a few opening words. Thanks, Henry.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, and welcome everyone to London Climate Action Week. Huge week of climate action across London, hundreds of events, thousands of participants getting involved. So it's a huge week for us in London. As Chris says, Henry Hall from the Greater London Authority, work for the Mayor of London on climate change, and our work, the work of the team kind of primarily focuses around achieving the net zero by 2030 target, so working more on the mitigation side. We're increasingly looking at tackling consumption-based emissions in London, and that is what we've been working with Climate Outreach to understand sort of methods for engaging and communicating with Londoners about, firstly, what we kind of trying to achieve in London with our net zero by 2030 target, but also the ways in which Londoners can get involved. So I'll just set the scene briefly in terms of what kind of our climate action is in London, and then kind of what we've looked to achieve with this work with Climate Outreach. So broadly in London, greenhouse gases have peaked in the year 2000 and have been falling since then, fallen about 45% since then, about 38% since the 1990 level, the kind of the level that people tend to start their accounting from. And the emissions are broadly split into three categories, kind of rough categories of transport, sort of commercial and industrial emissions, and then domestic emissions. In 2022, in 2021, the Mayor committed in his manifesto to a net zero by 2030 target. And then in 2022, alongside consultancy, published a kind of a plan of how we like to achieve net zero by 2030. So this was what we call the accelerated green pathway. You can have a look at it on the Greater London Authority website, but it basically makes assumptions of kind of scaling up green action hugely, rather than kind of assumptions around kind of huge grid decarbonisation or huge reliance on hydrogen rollout, for example. So to give a flavour of the sort of things which we're looking to achieve by year 2030, this would be retrofitting around 250,000 buildings in London, domestic and commercial buildings. About 2.2 million heat pumps would need to be in operation. Close to 500,000, 450,000 connections to domestic heat pumps. Heat networks would need to be in operation. And then, and we've made a kind of good strides towards this already, roughly a quarter reduction in the vehicle kilometres driven. So the ultra emission zone plays a part of that. Also, the kind of the expansion of different public transport methods in London as well. So that gives a flavour of the kind of things which we're kind of needing to achieve to get to this net zero by 2030 ambition. As you can imagine, a huge amount of this is, or a large amount of this is reliant on working with central government and with the 33 local authorities in London. The powers for these are kind of spread out between the three of us. The Mayor of London has particularly strong powers around planning and around transport. Obviously, Transport for London is under the Mayor's purview, but less so in other areas of kind of the things which we need to do to achieve net zero. So therefore, kind of these areas have rightly been our focus, kind of the things which we can do with other government bodies. However, we are aware that there's also a need to address the large consumption-based emissions as part of our greenhouse gases in London. So therefore, we need to make sure the public are fully engaged and supported as part of the process for kind of letting them know what we want to achieve in London, but also making sure that there's ways in which Londoners can contribute to this as well. So that's, to sum up, that's what we're working with Climate Outreach on, to understand different models of engagement and communication, what's been effective in other parts of the world, kind of the UK, London. Sort of, there's a huge amount of great work being done by different local authorities, both in London and outside, by different nations and by different cities internationally. We take a huge amount of learning from the mayor as the co-chair of C40 Cities, the international group of climate leading mayors. We take a huge amount of inspiration from other international cities as well. And now we're looking to sort of see what we can learn from this process to ensure that our net zero by 2030 target brings the public along with us. So I'll stop there and hand back to the team. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Henry, for your opening words, and thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. As Chris has said, I'm Emma James, a researcher at Climate Outreach, and I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some of our London insights from our Britain Talks Climate 2024 update. So I wanted to start today with our 3 key findings. These are our key findings across Britain, but we're seeing these really land in London as well. So the first, appetite for climate action is strong and enduring. The second, climate leadership is more likely to win votes than lose them. It offers a source of hope and the potential for reconnection. And third, people don't want to be left alone with this. Prioritise what's tangible and make transition fair. So we're really seeing these 3 findings, this appetite and desire for climate action and climate leadership, and that need for fairness among the transition, landing in London as well as across Britain. In terms of what we will cover today, so I'll be referring back to these 3 key findings throughout the session. And I'll start with a bit of a recap on what is Britain Talks Climate and the 7 British segments, building on what Chris has already introduced us to. I'll then dig into our London insights, more specifically from this research, so around appetite for climate action, climate leadership, fairness and specific climate policies. And as well as London Insights, I'll also mention our findings around looking at kind of rural versus urban city areas as well. I'll then hand back to Chris, who will take us through some recommendations for policymakers and communicators that are coming out of this research, and also what this looks like in London. And then, as Chris mentioned, we'll of course have time for a Q&A at the end. So to begin with, what is Britain Talks Climate? So Britain Talks Climate is a resource to help us engage with the British public on climate change. As Chris mentioned, this was a piece of research launched in 2020, a collaboration between Climate Outreach, More in Common, European Climate Foundation and YouGov. Britain Talks Climate exists to help us better understand and engage with people's priorities, their questions, their concerns. It helps us to tell clearer, more compelling climate stories that resonate with people of different values and different backgrounds. So this is our free open access resource for anyone who wants to effectively understand how people in Britain think and feel about climate and nature. So it's really a resource that's here to help you. It's full of insights, recommendations, do's and don'ts for talking about climate change to different people with different values and different backgrounds. Within Britain Talks Climate features 7 different segments of the British population. These segments are based on More in Common's core beliefs model. And we have 7 distinct audience segments across Britain, and these are segmented based on values, so people's values, their core beliefs, their identities. And what you can see on the screen here is the proportions that we see in London of these segments. So Britain Talks Climate and these 7 segments provides a shared and strategic understanding of the British public and identifies ways to engage across the whole of society. And so we have this values-based segmentation, and it's more than simply left versus right, leave versus remain. And it really digs into a whole host of issues and areas, including politics, but also areas such as gender, race, and issues such as community and safety. And so I'll be referring to some of these segments as we go through the session today, where we really want to dig into the kind of key differences across people and across Londoners. But what we're really going to be focusing on is what's shared. So the 7 segments helps us to understand the differences across people and the different ways they think and feel about climate change. But what's really interesting as well is how it helps us to look at the similarities, what's more in common, and what's shared across the British public. So that's really where the focus will be on today. In terms of what we did for Britain Talks Climate 2024, we started with 4 focus groups in December 2023 with 4 of the 7 British segments. And we then went on to conduct a nationally representative survey of 5,100 people. This survey was with the 7 British segments as well, and we boosted the sample in Wales and Scotland. So we got nationally representative samples there as well. We then went on to conduct 3 final focus groups with the final 3 segments out of the 7 British segments. Then, of course, went on to data analysis stage. And then from April 2024, we put out this work and disseminated this work. And you can find all of our insights for Britain Talks Climate 2024 on the Britain Talks Climate online toolkit on the Climate Outreach website. And so it's worth mentioning that within this nationally representative survey, the London sample is what we'll be focusing on today and the insights we've got from that sample. It's a relatively small sample, around 500 people. But this was as part of this wider nationally representative survey. And what we're seeing from this sample, we still see some really interesting insights on what Londoners think about climate change. And it's also worth mentioning that we are, through the session, including some other insights from other sources as well as Britain Talks Climate, just to illustrate really what Londoners are thinking about climate change and that sort of differences and similarities we see in the city as well as elsewhere across Britain. So I'll start today with our first key finding. So appetite for climate action is strong and enduring. In terms of our key headline findings across Britain, we're seeing that most people across Britain want to press ahead with net zero and believe that it would be good for the UK. So across Britain, we're seeing this desire to press ahead, this desire to move towards net zero and believing that it will be good for the UK. We're also seeing that across Brits, most believe climate change should sit above short-term politics. So this means politicians working together on climate change and agreeing an approach to this issue. We also see strong appetite for government to protect nature, to reduce pollution and to boost clean energy. So what's coming through really strongly in this research is this connection to nature that people feel, this concern around harm coming to nature, and this want for the government to prioritise protecting nature, as well as rolling out an enthusiasm for rolling out renewable energies and boosting that clean energy. We also see that policies that feel drastic or punitive and carry significant costs for individuals are the least popular. So these are our key headline findings across Britain, but these are things we're really seeing land in London as well. So looking at London more specifically, what we're seeing is that Londoners want to press ahead with net zero and believe that reaching net zero will be good for the UK. So what we did was presented 3 hypothetical political parties to survey respondents. Party A was a party pledging to speed up efforts to reach net zero. Party B was a party pledging to continue at the current pace in efforts to reach net zero. And Party C was a party pledging to slow down efforts to reach net zero. And what we saw among Londoners is that 62% wanted to speed up or go at the current pace in efforts to reach net zero. And only 15% of people in London want to see a slowdown. So there's this desire to push ahead and press ahead with net zero in London. Along with this, we have found that Londoners tend to think net zero will be good for the UK. So you can see on the screen, we asked the question, do you think that reaching net zero will be very good for the UK, mostly good for the UK, neither good nor bad, mostly bad, or very bad? We've broken this chart down by region. So if you go kind of 4 bars down, you can see Greater London. The orange sections are the percentages that feel net zero will be very good or mostly good for the UK. And the blue section, those percentages that feel it will be mostly bad or very bad for the UK. And so what we can see is that there is this high optimism in London around net zero. Londoners are more likely to think net zero will be very good for the UK, so 32%, and least likely to think net zero will be bad for the UK than anywhere else across Britain. So that's 6% thinking it would be bad for the UK. So we're really seeing this high optimism in London compared and more so than elsewhere. And we know when we're looking at kind of urban and rural perspectives as well, we see in this research that those in cities and urban areas are slightly more likely to think that net zero will be good for the UK than those in rural areas. So we're seeing this in London and we're seeing this in urban city areas as well. When we're thinking about climate impacts more generally, Londoners are concerned about nature and heat waves when thinking about these impacts. So we asked the question, which of the following impacts of climate change are you most worried about over the next 10 years? Select up to 3. And so we've highlighted London on the table here. We can see regions and nations along the top of the table and a rank 1 to 3 along the left. And what we're seeing here is that harm coming to nature and wildlife is a concern kind of across the board, across regions and nations. We know that kind of nature is coming through in this research as a top concern and priority for people. And again, when we're looking at kind of rural areas versus urban areas, this is the same for rural and urban areas. We see that this concern is therefore in cities and in kind of smaller villages. When we're thinking about sort of connection to nature, we see in this research that people that live in rural areas tend to feel slightly more connected to nature. But when we're looking at London specifically, we see that people in London are more connected to nature than not. So again, looking at the city, looking at London, we see this connection to nature. We see this concern around nature, similar to across Britain. And then we also see in London that the increased risk of heat waves is something that's a real concern to Londoners, more so than across other nations and regions across the UK, as you can see on the table. So this is an interesting finding, this concern specifically in London around heat waves. Again, we see this more so in cities and suburbs than kind of small towns and rural areas. So when we're looking at that urban versus rural, when we're looking at rural areas, we tend to see more concern around the risk of floods being a higher concern than elsewhere. But looking at London specifically, this increased risk of heat waves is specifically a concern among Londoners in the city. When we look at climate policy support in London more generally, so to sort of summarise the last few slides, we see this desire, this appetite and this optimism for climate action and leadership in London. People want to press ahead with net zero, and we see an enthusiasm around expanding renewables, boosting clean energy, even in local areas for Londoners. So that want to kind of push ahead with renewable energy and boosting clean energy, we see that among Londoners. However, in this research, we see that Londoners want the Mayor of London to prioritise issues such as crime, cost of living, affordable homes, and tackling homelessness. We can see that often climate might not be top of mind for Londoners, but this is understandable when we think about things like the cost of living crisis. Of course, these issues are a concern, but that doesn't mean that climate change isn't a concern. As we can see, people want to press ahead with net zero. They want climate leadership. And so we need to be thinking as communicators about talking about kind of issues people care about as connected. We need to connect the issues that people care about, as you can see on this slide, connect it to nature, connect it to climate change, and move towards the concerns that they have, connecting that to nature and climate, as we can see that people want this desire, people want this pushing ahead of climate action and leadership in London. Similar to across Britain, Londoners are less enthusiastic about policies that seem punitive or carry significant costs. So that coming back to that sort of concern around cost for the individual. In London, we see, for example, a policy of charging people more to fly. We see that 39% think this is going too far. However, this is still the minority. So there is this kind of acceptance around certain policies in London. When we think about motivation to act, so we know that Londoners want to press ahead with net zero, with climate action. Londoners are actually second most likely across Britain to feel motivated to act, but views on the cost of climate action differs across the 7 segments. So we've included a piece of research from Climate Barometer here. They were kind enough to share this with us for us to present today. So Climate Barometer has presented a question to a London sample around the cost of climate action versus inaction. So they asked, which of the following statements do you agree with most? The first being, it will cost too much to tackle climate change now, and we should be prioritising other things at a time when consumers can least afford it. And that's represented in that darker grey colour on the bar charts. And the second question, it will cost too much not to tackle climate change now, and we should be prioritising it while we still can avoid the worst impacts. And that's represented in that green colour on the bar charts. So what we can see here is that real lean across all segments towards that needing to that thought that it will cost too much not to tackle climate change now. So that, again, that desire to push ahead now is really there across the segments. And for all segments, the agreement with that second statement is higher than the first statement. Even when we see the segments we call disengaged traditionalists and backbone conservatives, we can see those don't knows coming up higher, but we still see that lean towards that second statement over thinking it will cost too much to tackle climate change now. So there is that want and desire for climate action right now across the 7 segments. And when we think about the segments such as disengaged traditionalists, we're seeing in the Britain Talks Climate 2024 research that they are more likely to say don't know throughout a lot of the research and a lot of the questions. We know that they're not opposed to policies and climate policies, but they're concerned about process and practical viability. So this is where we can start to see some of the differences across the segments, even though there is that lean towards, in general, thinking that it will cost too much not to tackle climate change now. So on to the second key finding of this work, climate leadership is more likely to win votes than lose them. It offers a source of hope and the potential for reconnection. So our key headline findings across Britain, people feel positive about government spending on climate and environmental initiatives. And this is linked to the word cloud that you can see on the slide here. We asked participants to write down the word they feel represent how they would feel if the government were to commit significant spending on climate and environmental initiatives. And 50% wrote a positive word. Happy was the word that was most cited, 10% wrote happy. And so we can see this positivity, only 23% chose to write a negative word. And this is something that really surprised us at Climate Outreach, and we're really excited to share this with you today. And what's really great about it is it was asking people to write their word. It was open text, and we can see this positivity shining through. There is broad agreement among Brits that it's not too late to act on climate change. However, relatively few feel they've been consulted or informed by governments when it comes to climate policy. When thinking about having a say and engaging on this topic, many believe it's important that local people have a say in things that concern their local area. And when we're thinking about information more generally, people want to hear more about climate action by government, so what governments are doing on climate change. And these are our key headline findings across Britain. Again, we're seeing these land in London as well, with some slight differences when we're thinking about how kind of perceptions among Londoners for being consulted and informed. And we'll get onto those differences as we go through the next slides. So views on trust in climate leadership in London. Again, we're going back to that optimism point. Londoners are optimistic about tackling climate change. 73% of people in London think there is still time for any UK government to tackle climate change. This is above average for Great Britain. And again, when we're looking at that kind of city versus rural differences, we can see those in cities and urban areas are slightly more likely to think that there is still time to tackle climate change than those in rural areas. And again, on optimism, we know from the wider literature, so for example, OECD 2020 research suggests that city dwellers appear to be more optimistic when compared to rural areas. So we know that there is this kind of wider optimism often in cities, but especially in London, we're really seeing this shine through. When it comes to trust, people in London are more likely to trust either national government or their local authority on various areas relating to the transition. And this is the same as what we're seeing across Britain as well. But what we are seeing is Londoners are more likely to trust national government on the transition than elsewhere across Britain. So this includes areas such as car reduction measures, electricity grid upgrades, new energy efficiency housing projects. We know that there is that kind of foundational level of trust in London there. But it is worth pointing out that around a quarter of Londoners trust none of the above on the transition. So neither local authorities or national government. And of course, this is in a wider context of kind of political distrust more generally, something that isn't unique to climate change. And around a quarter in London trusting none of the above. This is what we're seeing across Britain as well. When it comes to support in leaders, so support for leaders in the UK being ambitious on climate change differs across the 7 segments in London. Again, we wanted to share some work by Climate Barometer. So they asked the question, which of the following statements do you agree with most? And this was to the London sample. So we're seeing the 7 segments based on London here. The first statement, the UK should be one of the most ambitious countries in the world when it comes to addressing climate change, regardless of what other countries are doing, represented in that green colour on the bar charts. And the second statement, the UK should not take steps to address climate change until other bigger countries like the US and China agree to do the same. So what we're seeing here is generally among segments that sort of lean towards the UK being ambitious on in the world, regardless of what other countries are doing. But again, we start to see the differences across some of the segments. So we can see that the segments we call disengaged traditionalists, the segment we call backbone conservatives, slightly more lean towards the UK should not take steps until other bigger countries do the same. So we can see those differences coming through. However, we know that desire for kind of pushing ahead with net zero in the UK is there across the 7 segments. But we can start to see those sort of differences across the segments when we think about ambition compared to other countries. And thinking about engagement and consultation on climate change by leaders in London, these findings that we have shared on the slide here, this is fairly similar to what we're seeing across Britain. So Londoners would prefer to be engaged closer to home in their local community and face-to-face when it comes to climate change. So this is things like engaging when they're out and about in their local community, talking to MPs on the doorstep, engaging with local community groups in the community. We also asked why Londoners would take part in certain engagement activities. And what we heard was it's important that local people have a say in things that concern their local area. It's nice to hear others' opinions from their local area, and they see it as part of doing their bit. So what we're really seeing in London is this kind of connection and engagement to community. We see that people want to engage in their local community and they want to hear from others in their local community. And this is in line with further findings from our Britain Talks Climate 2024 research, in that we see a higher than average level of participation in volunteering in their local communities among Londoners. So 31% said they had volunteered in their local community. And this is higher than across all other nations and regions and higher than average for Britain. So we really see that kind of connection to community, wanting to do their bit for their community, benefit their community, be in their community and hear from others in their community. When it comes to being informed and consulted, people in London feel more informed or consulted on climate policies than elsewhere. However, this is still the minority. So, for example, 30% in London feel they have been given clear information from the government about what policies mean to them. And this is compared to a 17% British average. So we can see that there is that kind of useful starting point in London to continue increasing the amount of information and engagement options available to London. And finally, the final key finding. So people don't want to be left alone with this, prioritise what's tangible and make transition fair. So our final key headline findings across Britain, people are concerned about what the transition will cost them. All 7 segments are most worried about higher energy bills as a result of the transition. And the segments are most likely to say that expecting everyone to pay for new low carbon technologies themselves is something that would be going too far. So we can see that there is this concern around kind of the cost to the individual and not thinking that everyone should be paying for the transition and how this will work. Of course, this is understandable in a cost of living crisis, and this is something we're seeing in across Londoners as well. When it comes to fairness across Britain, we see low perceived fairness of climate change approaches set out by political parties and their leaders. And when we're thinking about specific climate policies, we see that in general, people across Britain tend to think public transport policies might be fair to them, but that home heating policies will be unfair to them. And when we're looking at these fairness findings, we see some differences when we're looking at the insights for London and what Londoners think and perceive as fair. And so we'll get onto a few of those differences in the next few slides. So to start with public transport, people in London are much more likely to use public transport than elsewhere across Britain. So you can see that we've broken this chart down by region again. If we go 4 bars down, we can see the bar for London. We can see those that kind of orange section on the graph is showing people say they use public transport every day or around every other day, and we can see that kind of jutting out ahead of the other nations and regions across Britain. For London, they're much more likely to use public transport more regularly than elsewhere in Britain, and that links on to their Londoners' perceptions of fairness on public transport. So Londoners are most likely to think public transport policies will be fair to them. So 55% in London think public transport will be fair to them, and only 27% think that they will be unfair. And this percentage, this 55%, is greater than across other nations and regions in Britain. They feel public transport will be fair to them in London. And it's interesting to think about the differences we see for urban city areas and rural areas here as well. So we asked the question, thinking about the policies relating to public transport that the government could put in place over the next 10 years to transition away from fossil fuels, do you think they will be definitely fair to people like me, probably be fair, probably be unfair, or definitely be unfair? And probably be fair and definitely be fair is represented in orange, probably be unfair, definitely be unfair represented in blue. And what we can see is the kind of perceptions of these public transport policies being fair is much greater in urban city centres and larger towns than in rural areas and villages. Onto heat pumps and home energy efficiency measures. We're seeing in London that Londoners are more likely to heat their homes via a heat pump than anywhere else across Britain, although this is very much still the small minority, so 12% in London. We also looked at London Council's polling 2023 research and found that 33% of Londoners say they have taken action to insulate their home, and 25% have switched to a renewable tariff. So there is this kind of push for action across home heating policies in London. There is this action happening. And finally, when it comes to fairness, Londoners are most likely to think home heating policies will be fair to them than anywhere else across Britain. So what we see across Britain is that people tend to lean towards thinking that home heating policies will be unfair to them, whereas people in London are most likely to think home heating policies will be fair to them. So there is this kind of foundational perception of fairness of policies in London. 54% in London think home heating policies will be fair to them versus 34% thinking they will be unfair. And again, we wanted to touch on the differences we see for urban city centres and rural areas here. We asked the same question, but instead related to home heating policies that the government could put in place. And again, what we see here is for larger towns and urban city centres, they're more likely to think home heating policies will be fair definitely be fair, probably be fair to them than in rural areas and villages. And there's more of that lean towards thinking they'll be unfair in rural areas. So that is it from me and our key findings and insights across London as well as city and rural areas. I wanted to come back to our 3 key findings to hopefully point out how we kind of have found these land in London as well. So the first, appetite for climate action is strong and enduring. The second, climate leadership is more likely to win votes than lose them. It offers a source of hope and the potential for reconnection. And third, people don't want to be left alone with this. Prioritise what's tangible and make transition fair. And I'll now hand back to Chris, who will take us through some of the recommendations that are coming through from this work.
Thanks, Emma. Always fascinating. If anyone has any questions, I'll just remind you to put them in the Q&A. So what does this mean? What do these findings mean for policymakers and communicators? So first, for sort of governments and policymakers, be clear that tackling climate change is a collective national endeavour led by governments. People want to be part of something, but they want to see leadership to drive that forward. And this should give governments, policymakers confidence that they can seize that opportunity and be supported by the public about being innovative and bold, particularly in our research here about rolling out clean energy and those specifics on those topics. But it's also really important that governments, policymakers make this transition fair. People want to see change, but they don't want to be shouldering the burden, and they're juggling things in their own lives and different priorities that mean that it has to be, they want these policies to be fair between themselves and others in the country. And how do you make that fair? Well, one way forward is listening, learning, and responding genuinely, authentically to people who are most nervous about change and the arguments and the concerns that people have around those changes. And in London, we see that ways of doing that. Emma highlighted about doing that kind of face-to-face in local communities and accessing and talking to people on their own terms there. And finally, on this slide, we have developing a national plan to listen and inspire to the whole country on the climate transition. Again, that's seeing that leadership at the top, as well as leadership in lots of other areas. So when we talk about government here, necessarily in policymakers, it's not just national, it's not just London-wide, it's people who are working on behalf of the public to try and create these policies and make the society and do the things that we've shown that people want to see. So the next 2 slides we've got are some do's and don'ts for communicating climate leadership. So a lot of you on this call, I'm sure, are experienced communicators. So you'll have some thoughts on these as well that you can always bring up in the Q&A. So first of all, highlight, there's wide support for leadership on climate and nature. Often people think that others around them don't have the same views that they do, the positive views on climate action that they do. So it's really important that we normalise that and see that everybody really wants these changes to be made, or the vast majority. Secondly, drawing out those connections between a healthy climate, thriving nature, and our own well-being. So that's the co-benefits of climate action. Good things that happen, not just climate as a separate issue, but across the board there. In London, we know, people are really, as elsewhere in the UK, people are really concerned about nature. So using that as a hook to talk about climate action. Connect our British obsession with the weather to growing climate concern. And again, that's similar to the point above when we talk about heat waves. Emma pointed out that that's something that comes up in London, or is highlighted in London more than elsewhere in our research. So being able to talk about that because people understand it and it affects them directly, that's a good way to hook onto climate action. Fourth is talking about the progress that's already underway and how that benefits people. In London, people are already really optimistic, or more optimistic, about change and the opportunity to change, but we can't rest on our laurels and take that for granted. That's something that we should really build and reinforce. And that's not just talking about action taken at the top or actions that people can take in their individual lives, but everything across the board in communities, from a government point of view and for individuals. What's happening and how is it benefiting people? And finally, recognising that for a lot of people, this kind of change is going to be scary. This is change in the actions that we're asking people to do, but also the change in the climate itself. And asking people to do these things and get involved when times are really hard is even scarier. We know in London there is this perception, there's a high perception of fairness of certain policies that we talked about compared with other countries. So that's really good. But fairness, it's really important. We can't assume as communicators that we know what fairness is to other people. We have to actually go and talk to people and have those conversations to see, is this fair for you, and how does that land for things that we don't necessarily understand about the way in their lives. And a couple of final don'ts for climate communicators here. So don't fuel the idea that climate change is all about more hardship and sacrifice and giving up the good things in life, because it's not about that. And don't talk of drastic or draconian approaches. That goes right against the fairness, all the data on fairness that we found and how people want to see climate action taken. And finally, don't pit different aspects of climate and nature crises against each other. We know that the climate and nature crises are twin crises that are so well interlinked, and we know that talking about one can help us take action on the other. So really avoid doing a one or the other there. Okay, thank you very much. I think now we can move into the Q&A section. So first question I have on the list here is, do you have any detailed data or more detailed data on Londoners' attitudes to heat in particular? I don't know if Emma, you want to say anything more that we have on that?
Yeah, I can kick us off. Thank you very much for the question. And yeah, it's a really kind of interesting finding that we're really keen to dig into more. I think we don't have a lot more from this Britain Talks Climate 2024 research in terms of kind of, I guess, how people view that, what that concern kind of, I guess, manifests as and looks like in real life. We know that is more of a concern in London than elsewhere. But yeah, I think we'd really love to dig into that a bit more and see kind of what that really looks like in I guess in the city, and really it's sort of the point on kind of, we want to dig into more kind of around what connection to nature looks like and feels like to people. That's similar for heat waves. What does that really kind of look like for people? So not a whole lot more data on that, but definitely something that we'd like to dig into more.
Henry, do you have any comments on that, about what you know about what's going on at the moment with heat and folk in London?
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, obviously, London is hotter than the rest of the country on average. The urban heat island effect is real, so it cools down less at night. We had our first 40-degree summer a couple of years ago, and the number of kind of high temperature summers has increased. So, in some ways, you completely understand why the concern in London is higher, because it is hotter. We're doing a few things to try and support Londoners deal with this. So a few tools which we've produced allow Londoners to get to less hot areas. So there's a thing called a urban heat map, an urban cooling map, where Londoners can see areas which are cooling down, areas to cool down, so areas around water and shade. But essentially, the building fabric needs to change to allow Londoners to cool down more effectively. We don't want to promote a change to kind of greater consumption by other cooling methods, fans and air conditioning units, etc. So, I mean, that I think that's probably what's behind the heating. This is a really interesting finding for us, because it is something which we know is true in London. How can we now use this as a motivator for taking climate action? There's lots of things which we can do which have an impact in heating in London. Tree planting, great access to urban, to green spaces, great access to kind of open water. So there's some things which we can do to adapt to the impact, but kind of how can we use this as a prompt to reduce emissions as well.
Thanks, Henry. Another quick couple of questions for Emma here. I'm going to put two together. One is about the representativeness of the sample just being of 500, and the other is, were there any differences in the proportion of segments in London compared to the rest of the country?
Thank you. Yeah, so we see some differences with the 7 segments. So what we see in London is fairly similar, but slightly more loyal nationals, established liberals, and backbone conservatives. We see slightly higher percentages there in London. Progressive activists, civic pragmatists, disengaged traditionalists are pretty much the same, exactly the same. And then we see slightly less disengaged battlers. So we are seeing some slight variations, but in general, they are kind of very similar to what we're seeing across Britain. In terms of the sample, yes, so it is a relatively small sample of 500. It's as part of that wider nationally representative sample. So when we're looking at the kind of the differences across the regions, we know that that is from a nationally representative sample. And as I said, I think it's a really good starting point for starting to see these insights on what Londoners think. Although relatively small, we know that it is from that wider representative sample, and so we are starting to see those key insights that we're seeing in the city. Yeah, Chris, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on the sample size, but yeah, thank you for the question.
No, I think you covered it. I think it's a really good start as part of the wider sample. I'll come to Namira next for the next question. So this is about broader perceived skepticism of experts and how to engage groups that might have experienced this skepticism. I guess we might call them more the disengaged segments of the more in common segmentation.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris, so much. I think I'll just pull in two points that Emma had mentioned earlier, but sort of just to drill into them a bit more. One is that seeing is believing. A lot of our research is pointing towards that getting more tangible and practical helps people sort of understand the whole sort of issues and how they're interlinked better. So when we talk about this transition that we're speaking, this year will be better than the ones that people have gone through before, that does not work because people tend to get skeptical about these big claims that are made. So one way to engage people that may not have been engaged previously is to connect sort of all the issues together, because we see that how we solve healthcare or how we solve better housing, all of it is related together with how we solve climate change. So I guess the point is that climate is the story that is underpinning all the things that people are looking at for good examples that are happening around us. So as much as we can see good examples, we need to share those in local campaigning, local communications, or drawing those out and telling sort of the good stories that are working. And the other thing would be to connect climate and nature. We see that again and again in our research that climate and nature are not separate when a lot of Londoners especially, but also Brits, are thinking about climate change. We see that climate and nature have continuously been amongst the fourth highest priority for people. So that would be another way to engage sort of the otherwise less engaged, connecting. I know that I see that in my borough where I'm living in London, in north of London, where people generally don't care about climate change when you ask them, but they care about the bee population, they care about the local fauna and flora. And that's all we want. We just want to help them see that this is exactly what we're talking about. We don't need to have them be out on the streets and protest and be like climate justice and climate change. So we can help them see that nature and climate is also the natural linkage. So I think that's the second sort of important point that we see from our research, that people care about nature and climate together. And that's what sort of can help us get more people engaged.
Mute. Coming straight back to you, Namira, on this one about sort of language used in communications. So, for example, net zero and the way that you've just talked about connecting with nature. What about things to do with different kinds of technical language?
Yeah, this is fast becoming my favorite topic, a sub topic whenever we discuss. But I'm so proud of the work that our colleagues have done at Climate Outreach, because basically what we did was we wanted to test the baggage attached around net zero, because our research would suggest that the idea of net zero is not the problem. So our research colleagues, they tested 3 terms to see which people prefer. And amongst the 3 terms, one was Britain reaches net zero. The other talked about Britain ending its contribution to climate change. And the third was Britain balances the amount of carbon emissions produced and the carbon emissions removed. And what's so fascinating is that the most popular option was about balancing. And I find it fascinating because the idea of restoring balance to whatever it may be, but in this case, to emissions in the planet, is appealing to people across the 7 segments. And in particular, to those that are more right-leaning. So what we see is that whenever we can, we don't need to use technical terms to engage more people. We can say simple phrases. So instead of saying net zero, we can say warmer homes. We can say cleaner air. We can say great public transport. So again, our research, maintains our point that great climate communication is to talk like a human. So if there are possible opportunities, we don't always need to be talking about sort of net zero or emissions. We can talk about cleaner air and warmer homes, etc. So I find that fascinating.
One quick final question from the Q&A is about a common national discourse on divisive policies and sort of misinformation, or being able to challenge different kinds of views that might not necessarily be bounded in the kind of evidence and things that we think about. I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that very briefly, and thoughts on challenging kind of disinformation, I guess.
I'm happy to come in from a London perspective. I mean, not the high-profile case of this recently is around the optional emission zone expansion, which came into place almost a year ago now. So I think this demonstrates that it can be challenged and it can be effective. There was a huge amount of disinformation around the optional emission zone expansion, the optional emission zone in general. But the fact that the mayor was re-elected in last month, despite the expansion happening sort of a handful of months beforehand, before really a lot of the evidence of the impact of the expanded zone could be shown, the 1 year on report, etc., which we're expecting soon. So it shows that it can be done. I think some of the ways which you challenging it, or some of the ways we have challenged it, are 3 of the things which have been discussed. So the ultra emission zone expansion, it was communicated as a air pollution reduction measure. We know that people in London hugely care about air pollution. They're hugely worried about it. The impact on health is kind of seen massively, but it also has a massive impact on, or a very large impact on, greenhouse gas emissions. So the expansion of the ultra emission zone reduced greenhouse gas emissions to transport from about 5 or 6%. So it's a kind of big chunk just from one single measure. So the way in which we've done it in London is using local actors, local leaders, not necessarily using the mayor as the figurehead for these campaigns all the time. So we've worked lots with other air pollution activists, other air pollution pressure groups, lots with scientists. We had some excellent sessions with some newly famous scientists through the pandemic. So Professor Chris Whitty was a big advocate of our work when we were promoting this last summer. So that we found that actually kind of engaging with some of these people who aren't necessarily politicians, and they can be the spokespeople for achieving what we want to do. As I said, it had a transformational air pollution impact, but also carbon emissions reduction as well.
Thanks, Henry. That's great. That's the end of the questions come in, and we're coming towards the end of our time now. So I'll just thanks so much for everyone who put the questions in the Q&A box, and thanks to our panel, Henry, Emma, and Namira, for answering them so well. One thing we do like to do after we've done our webinars is we're always interested in the kind of things that our attendees will do with what you've learned today. And the way that we can do this is if you're able to scan the QR code that's on screen now, or go to menti.com and enter the code there. We've just got a question asking you about what you've learned today and what you might be thinking about doing in the future with that. So please go on there and enter what you think about what we've been talking about today, or any other questions. And I will say thank you very much for everybody coming along, and have a great day.
Thank you, Chris.